Zoom session. Remember to feel free to share any questions or comments in the chat at any time. And later today, you're going to receive a brief survey, and we would really appreciate your feedback. We also hope you'll join us for other Love Data Week sessions and for our in-person open house on Friday. So thank you again for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Sim.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending today. My name is Simran Kaur. You can call me Sim. I am the Survey Research Analyst in Student Affairs. I work on a team called CRAFT, which, as we all know, we love our acronyms. So it stands for Communication, Research, Assessment, Fundraising, and Technology. We do not have to remember any of that, but it is cool to know that we're actually dual-faceted. And so part of our team is data and analytics, and the other half is marketing and communication. And so we have this really cool integration, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the projects that we do as well. Um, but I focus specifically on survey assessments, and so I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about what makes a good survey, what things to consider when sending them out, and overall how all of those things play a role in helping our response rates at the end of the day. So foundationally, before we get into thinking about things like incentives and how do I get my response rates up, I think it's really important to think about why we're doing an assessment in the first place. And so, as much as being a survey person means that I love creating surveys, I think it's just as important for me to recognize when not to do a survey. So, some of the things that I like to always ask folks when they come to me saying that this is something they'd like to do are two parts. So, the first part is just who's your target audience? Who is your population, and how can a survey actually help us to understand that population more than we already do? And some considerations that we like to keep in mind are, is there data that we already have that answers those questions? Are there dashboards that exist? Are there analyses that we just haven't done on data that we could be doing more analyses on before we go ahead and inundate students, staff, or faculty with a survey? If we know that a target population is something that we need to learn more about, then I try to focus them a little bit more on the goals. And so that can be what exactly you're doing with that data. So a question I like to always ask is, if I were to hand you the data set of responses tomorrow, what can you actually do with that data? And so coming up with that action plan, thinking about what that data and that output will look like will help us to create surveys that actually follow what your goals are, right? That can be creating different kinds of methodologies, that could be thinking about different ways to recruit participants. And so all of that plays a role in the process of getting to that end goal. So what makes a good question? I think your actual questions are going to play a role in how many questions students actually respond to. And so these are just some tiny things that I like to keep in mind when designing questions that seem really small, but when combined together can make a really big impact on your response rates and making a really good survey. Um, so making it count, we like to be very intentional with the questions that we ask. Going back to our goals, we want to make sure that each question latches on to a goal that we have and making sure that we're not just asking it because it would be something that would be nice to know, but it's something that we do really need to know, and students are taking the time to respond to our survey. So we want to make sure we're utilizing that response correctly. We want to ask one thing at a time. We don't like to ask double-barrel things because, from a researcher perspective, that can be really difficult for us to be able to analyze afterwards. So, if we're asking, did you like this event and would you go to it again? A simple yes or no might not really answer that question because we don't know if a yes means they're answering yes to one of those things or both of those things. We try to be as neutral as possible in the framing that we write, and so even something as asking a satisfaction question of how satisfied are you with this thing could lean a little bit more positively. So something as simple as saying how satisfied or dissatisfied are you with this can make a difference in trying to be as net neutral as possible, so that way we're not priming anyone to think positively or negatively about whatever it is we're evaluating. We want to avoid jargon. I think I have fallen victim to this many times where I get kind of caught in my own bubble. And I think that I'm using terms that students might understand and that's easy to understand, but really it's only just on the forefront of my mind. So trying to avoid acronyms, trying to avoid terminology that tends to be more part of uh, the professional world rather than that of common language of students. is going to be helpful. One, again, so that way they answer the question, but two, that they're answering it in a way that you expect them to be answering it. So that way it's a reliable and valid question. We want to avoid fatigue. I think everyone's emails are inundated. And so we want to make sure that, again, everything is intentional, that we're trying to align it to make sure it's not coinciding with other things that are happening on campus. And that we're not asking, this large kitchen sinky survey with 60 questions unless that's really necessary for us to be doing. And so we want to keep things as short and sweet as possible so that way everyone can be happy while answering it. And then finally, testing it out. I think it's very easy to get caught up in your own world of I'm working on this and I've been looking at this for 8 hours and I think it's good. You can send things off to testing, whether that's with students, whether that's with colleagues, and get feedback on everything. I always encourage feedback on anything as small as formatting, punctuation, grammar. Did it feel right to be able to answer this question in this order, or did I feel like I was making you mentally jump around? And so testing is arguably one of the most important things before you go and send out a survey, and it'll also help with making sure that there's not as many things that might need to be fixed post-distribution. So we like to ask what's called a Net Promoter Score question. And you might have seen this in some of the surveys that have come out of student affairs, and it does get used institutionally as well a bit, but it actually pulls from a market research approach. So you might also have seen this if you ever went to a store and you received a survey in your email afterwards that's saying, how likely are you to recommend us to someone? That's the Net Promoter Score framing. And so this kind of approach is on a 0 to 10 scale, and it takes those numbers and it classifies them into these groups. And so anywhere from a 0 to 6 is what this theory kind of calls a detractor, which is basically the folks that are saying, well, I probably maybe didn't have the best experience. Even if it's slightly positive, they're just not that likely to be able to go to their friend and say, Stony Brook is so great. I'm telling you, you need to go here. They're the ones that might tell their friends some struggles that they might have had on campus. On the flip side, the nines and tens are your promoters, and they're the ones that would be cheerleaders. They're the ones that are saying, I love it here. I'm doing really good. I made a group of friends. There's a lot of opportunities. I tell all of my friends and my younger siblings that they should be going here. Now, interestingly enough, there's this middle group that's called your passives. And this approach looks at passives to say one really good experience could make them be a promoter, or one really bad experience could make them a detractor. And so they're this kind of middle group that could go either way. And at the end of the day, a Net Promoter Score is still a score. So in order to get that score, you take that number of promoters and you subtract it from the number of detractors. And so thinking statsy, you can be a negative 100 to a positive 100 scale. And while the passives aren't necessarily included in that kind of formula, they are included in the overall denominator of the amount of people that completed that survey. And so Net Promoter Scores aren't that great to look at an individual score, but they're great for comparisons. So an example of a Net Promoter Score question that we ask is in our Welcome Week survey, which is essentially orientation. We frame it so that way we're asking based specifically on their experiences during New Seabook Welcome Week, how likely are they to recommend Stony Brook University to a friend or a peer? You can see that detractors are roughly 26%, promoters are roughly 30%, and passives are roughly 44%. We use Qualtrics as our predominant platform, and so Qualtrics has a Net Promoter Score question setting built into it. And so it gives us this really nice output of giving us an NPS group, which is that first bar chart, or you can look at the actual number that they selected, so your 0 to 10. I like to color code things, so the 9s, 10s are red because those are promoters. The 0 to 6 are that dark gray color because they align with what a detractor is. So we asked two additional questions in the survey that are really interesting to me. And so one of those questions is asking how helpful Welcome Week was during the first week. We intentionally knew that we were going to be asking this question, and so we don't send this survey out until the second week of classes so they can specifically answer this question, which again kind of goes back to thinking about your goals so that way we can time things and create a process that matches those goals. And so about 78% of students said, yes, it was helpful for me, 22% no, but 78 is a fantastic number, and we love to see that. Another question that we asked was asking their ranking of Stony Brook. So we asked, was it in your top three choices of college? And again, 82% of students said yes, it was, which for us is fantastic to hear. Individually speaking, knowing that UC with Welcome helped and that Stony Brook was in their top three was really interesting to know. But what happens when you look at these together? And so what we saw was actually a different story. And what we're seeing here is that for the students that said Stony Brook was in their top three, they were rating New Seal Welcome to be more helpful than students who said it wasn't in your top three. That might come off as concerning, but there's different perspectives that we could take to something like this. And so a different approach to look at this could be, well, maybe the students who said that Stony Brook was in their top three didn't need as much help. Maybe they're the students that applied for Ivies, they applied for Brown, they applied for Yale, they applied for high-end UC schools, and Stony Brook was their safety school. And so they might not need a helping hand as much during the first week because they were already integrated into how to be a successful student because those are the goals that they had for themselves. And so this might not be a negative thing, and it could help to guide us on which group of students we actually do want to focus on, who we want to give more resources to, who we want to do more intentional outreach towards. And so creating this narrative and this story is really important and really cool things that come out of data if you have that entire process in mind before you go ahead and distribute a survey. So just some best practices that, again, I like to keep in mind. Generally, we like to keep the mental load as little as possible. And so one of the things we can do to do that is to group related questions together. So thinking about an event, for an example, if you want to know some logistics, you want to know how communication was, you want to know how the food was, and you want to know the actual content of the event. Asking those things in the beginning and then you can ask conceptual questions at the end can help them to kind of think logistically and sequentially about what happened, and it makes it easier for them to actually respond to those items. And so thinking about like how that day went, so that way, again, mentally, if you're thinking about your time of day and I'm thinking about this morning, okay, well, I woke up and I had breakfast and then I drove to work and then I worked on this, is easier for me to answer than asking me what I had for lunch and then asking me how many projects I did in a day and then asking me what time I woke up. It's making me think more in my mind. And so I might not be that enticed to complete the survey anymore because I'm like, this is too much for me to think about. Keeping that in mind, we do tend to have drop off in surveys in general. That's not specific to Stony Brook, that's just a general experience. And so choosing what your first question is very important because that's the question that's most likely to be answered. We tend to prioritize that Net Promoter Score question because for us, a response to that item will help us give comparison data to other surveys that have asked Net Promoter Score questions. And so we tend to prioritize that. We want to make sure that question applies to everyone, that it's not a logic-based item that only a group of students are seeing. We want it to be easy, quick, and if that was the only question that was going to be answered in your survey, is that the most important thing that you're asking? As a little like tip and trick, if you're asking any sensitive questions, we like to ask them towards the end, mainly because we want to give them a chance to answer honestly for the actual items and then share any additional information as an optional choice for them. So if you're asking a question about event evaluation, but in the beginning of the survey, you're asking them about, do you live on campus? What's your sexual orientation? What's your race and religion? They might associate those items with affecting their responses or how they're going to be perceived for the rest of the items, so it might affect how they answer things. So I'm just going to go through a couple examples of what a not so great question is and how we could possibly adjust it, just so that you have a little bit of that context in mind. So an example of a double-barreled, although this is more like quadruple-barreled. So do you personally subscribe to or regularly read any periodicals, magazines, newsletters that are specifically related to your occupation? An answer like yes doesn't quite help to get any granularity into any part of that question, right? I could say yes because I only read magazines, or I could say yes because I'm reading all of that, everything that I offered, but there's no differentiation in that as the researcher, and so I don't think there's much that I can do with that answer. However, another way to ask this is to separate those out. So you can ask them to indicate whether they read any of those items and ask them if they do or they don't. And now you have a select all where you can see specifically which things they subscribe to and which they don't. Another kind of question is something a little bit more conceptually you would think is easy enough, but it's very easy to kind of skip over, is making sure that every question actually requires an answer. And so asking a question like, if you made dinner at home last night, how many minutes did it take for you to prepare the meal? Now, if I did cook dinner last night, this is great because I can put how many minutes it took for me to cook that meal. However, if I didn't, I now have two options. I can put 0 minutes, which could mean that I didn't do it at all, or I could leave that question blank because I'm saying this doesn't apply to me as 0 minutes. I'm just going to move on to the next one. As someone who's analyzing that data, I don't know if they left that question blank because they didn't cook dinner or because they skipped over that question. And now it's hard for me to understand what to take away from an answer that's blank, which could be a good chunk of your responses. So another way that you can go about this is to actually separate those two items out. And a lot of platforms and software now offer display logic. And so you can say if a certain answer is selected, then show this question instead. And so you can ask, did you make dinner at home last night? And if they select yes, then you can have an additional question pop up that says, how many minutes did it take to prepare your meal? Even if you're using a platform that doesn't have display logic, you can just be more specific and you can say, did you make dinner? And a second question, if you said yes, how many minutes? And so there's definitely workarounds based on whatever you're using, but conceptually just making sure that every question does require that answer and that it's easy to answer. So speaking of platforms, I'm just going to quickly go through and give some questions you might want to think of mind if you're not sure what platform you want to use. There are a lot out there. So going back to basics and making pro cons lists are extremely helpful. So you want to think about what things you're looking for in a platform, whether that's full customization. Do you want things that give you just templates? What level of security you want to have? How you want to distribute that survey, how you want to collect responses, and then how do you like to report things? Do you want to just have an Excel that you can work on? Do you want it to pull into other data analytics tools like Tableau or SPSS? Do you want dashboarding built into it or reporting? And so these are all kind of bells and whistles that's good for you to have, and then you can go and look for different platforms. These are some of the features. I'm obviously not going to go through all of these, but some things to keep in mind for features that might be helpful. We in Craft really like our bells and whistles, and so we try to get as much as possible out of our platforms. So it gives us the full creative range to be able to do really cool methodologies. And so, like I said, we love to use Qualtrics. Everyone at Stony Brook has an institutional license, and so that's something that's available to you. And we in Craft, and me specifically, always love to be a resource to help with any Qualtrics related questions. And so I'm always here if you need anything. But there are other forms that are out there. I'm sure you've heard of Google Forms and Microsoft Forms. JotForm is popular. Typeform is popular. Mentimeter, and now Vivox is something that's available on Stony Brook's campus. There's assessment tools and Handshake and SB Engaged. And so there's a lot that's out there. So I definitely recommend exploring your options, seeing what level you're comfortable with, and then playing around with it to see is it doing what you want it to be doing. And so, like I said, Qualtrics is something I wish they would sponsor me with the amount that I tell people that they should use it. It is a really fantastic tool. You can edit everything from HTML, CSS, JavaScript, or just go and do the basic question types if you want. There's a lot that it has to offer. But one of the things that I really enjoy is how it distributes surveys. And so, again, based on what your goals are, we tend to offer two methodologies for how you want to distribute your survey, which can affect how many students are responding to your survey. In a lot of cases, email can do the trick, and in Qualtrics, you can edit all parts of the email. So you can change who the from sender is, the reply to email, the subject line, the body. You can edit all of that to make it look like it's coming directly from a Gmail inbox to a Gmail inbox, but it's actually being sent through Qualtrics. And you can send reminder emails and lots of cool things through it. You can also just do regular links. So if you want to send it out to your personal email, it can generate a regular link and you can have that. Another form we like to offer are QR codes. So for example, the first destination survey is something that we have worked on for the last few years. It's a survey that tries to understand what students who are graduating are doing after they graduate. And so it was really beneficial for us for a project like that to use QR codes. That way we could receive feedback at events that graduates are supposed to be going to, like grad day, for example. And so that really helped our response rates to know that they didn't have to look through their email. They had a QR code printed, they had kiosks there. And so there was several different forms and methods for students to fill it out, and that really helped us at the end of the day. So just to chat a little bit about craft, again, we have two sides of a coin. We have our data and analytics that's run by the Executive Director of Strategic Analytics and Technologies, Ahmed Belazi. And then the other half of our team, which is marketing communication, which is run by Sonia Garrido. Marketing communications for student affairs is centralized, and so their team has expanded quite a bit, and data analytics is working our way towards that. In student affairs, we have kind of satellite craft folks that are fantastic, and we have folks in student health. We have folks that are in IT, in student life, in campus res, and career center, and so we've really been expanding. And we also, again, because we have this really cool relationship with marketing and understanding what's the best way to write email invitations and subject lines, we've been able to do some really cool joint projects. But one of the really big institutional projects that I mentioned before is called the Campus Pulse Survey. And so we have collaborated with institutional research to kind of have this campus-wide survey that goes out. And it's very simple. It's actually 1 to 2 questions. One is an NPS question with the option of an open text question. And so we frame it to say, based on your experiences this week, how likely are you to recommend Stony Brook University to a friend or peer? This survey does not go out to all students at once. We actually segmented the student population. And so about roughly 20% of all students will receive this on a weekly basis, with every student seeing it 3 times a semester. And what's really cool about this is it kind of helps to address that problem of fatigue, because not everyone is receiving this on a weekly basis. But also help us to understand in a more quick way of what's happening, what's important, other things that need to be immediately addressed. And so the left side is what it'll look like on kind of a monitor or a laptop, and the right side is what it would look like on mobile. And so we try to be very cognizant of following ADA compliance, making sure that surveys can be completed on screen readers and tablets and phones all alike. And so again, one of those considerations that's built into Qualtrics as well, if you make sure to kind of turn those features on. And we do also ask an additional follow-up that says, is it okay if we reach out to you about your comments? And so it helps us to create this connection with students to be able to do something about the feedback that they provide. One of those ways that we increase the response rate is we actually take that NPS question and we embed it directly into the email invitation. And so when someone says, I'm feeling like a 7 right now, they'll select the 7, and then it'll open a web page where they see the full survey, quote unquote, which is additionally the open text and then the consent question. And so what's cool about that is that 7 that they selected is actually already recorded under their name. And so we know that they said a 7, and anything that's additional that they would like to report, they can share with us. Once they click submit, we'll have that. And so again, convenience and using your tools that are available to you, that Craft can help you with, really could be beneficial for increasing those response rates and making sure that you're getting as many answers as you possibly can. And probably what you were initially thinking when you entered for this presentation is, well, what about incentives? Everyone says should give incentives. What are you doing for it? And so there's a lot of research on incentives. There's research that says that you can have a high reward with a low chance, or a high chance with a low reward. And we kind of took this mixed methods approach when it comes to that, and we made ours time-based. The Pulse survey goes out on a Tuesday, and so if you respond within 2 days, you get 10 raffle entries. Within 4 days, you get 5. Within 6 days, you get 2, and then anything after a week, you get 1. We offer about 8 to 10 prizes. And again, we are in a place of privilege. We're really able to budgetarily buy all of these things. And we have the bandwidth to be able to make a Power Query to analyze how many raffle entries a single person did based on their time. And so that's definitely necessary in order to be able to do something like this. It is not the only correct way. It is not the correct way. Incentives are a very widely studied area, and so I highly encourage you to go read and see if there's other things that align with what resources you have, what budget you have, what time you have. But it definitely does help to have an external motivation for students. But at the end of the day, I think it kind of comes down to if you were to complete a survey, what motivates you to complete that? And so keeping those things in mind of when you as a consumer receive things, what is it that you want to receive? And we can incorporate that into our work on a day-to-day as well. And so that's basically everything that I had. I know I covered a bunch of different topics, but I really want to thank everyone for coming today. I think the presentations will be sent out at some point, but if you'd like to have them on hand, you can scan that QR code and you can also connect with me anywhere you'd like. I have my LinkedIn, email, however you want to chat. Um, I'm always happy to connect. And the slide deck also has, I put like a little parking lot. So there's additional resources and stuff. I put examples of some demographic questions if you want to copy and paste, an NPS question, and then some additional resources if you're just interested in other things. But thank you all so much. If you have any questions, you can feel free to unmute or put it in the chat, however you would like.
Thank you, Sim. This has been amazing. So my question is, how do you decide on your point scale, whether it's a 3 point, a 5 point, a 7, or a 10?
Great question. And I will say that every person that you ask is going to answer that question differently. And so, my perspective on it is typically we tend to go into like a 5 point scale in general if we're going like overall satisfaction, right? So we'll do two on like a negative anchor, two on a positive anchor, and one in the middle. There's definitely arguments for doing a 7 point. There's arguments for a 10 point. We follow what's technically an 11 point scale for NPS because that's an established kind of theory and methodological approach. And so we follow it for that. But genuinely, it is your preference of granularity. And so if you want something where you can say, I need to know the difference between this and this. And so I want to do a 100 point scale, like a grading scale. You can very well do that if that's your goal. A 0 to 10 scale tends to be a little bit more popular because it gives folks a little bit more of an understanding of like ordinal sentiment, right? Like what's the difference realistically between a 6 and a 7? Pretty difficult to tell, but it might be easier to understand a difference between a positive and a negative sentiment compared to a 3 point scale. And so it just kind of depends on what your goal is for that question. I personally tend to lead towards either 5 point or 10 points, like item scales, depending on what it is I'm actually asking, though. Okay, in my defense, Sean, in my defense, I was not going to bring it up.
I was totally thinking about that too. Six, seven.
The best part is I wasn't. And like I'm supposed to be the Gen Z here.
So sorry, another quick
No,
question. So what
absolutely.
some incentive strategies have you found most effective for improving response rates at Stony Brook?
Yeah, so I think I hate to be the one of like, it depends. Like it does kind of depend. So we do find some really cool like the pulse strategy, especially in the beginning, was working really well. I think it was mainly because it was a different way than students were seeing of like one raffle entry. And so the novelty of it kind of helped with that. But we've worked, for example, campus residences, we did a survey with them and they offered like discount for housing in the next year and things like that. And so they related it to things that they had in their control to be able to help with that targeted population of students. So they gave the incentive that they knew would help kind of fill the hearts of people who are living on campus. And so I think relating it as much to the population that you're going to as possible will really help, which is also why kind of that goal aspect of things will help you to strategize what group of students you want to do it to. I think it's great that a lot of times we want to send it out to all students because we want all feedback from students. But if really what you're asking for is something that's targeted, then we can just go specifically to that group and we can make sure that we're being very intentional about how we're framing things and what they're offering it so that way they can feel like it's something that's really going to bring an impact to their day-to-day life. And in general, when it comes to like physical incentives, I think it's really great to always get things from the bookstore because it also is almost like marketing for the university for someone to say, "Hey, I won this shirt in a survey, like it was free and it's Peanuts branded. Like how great is that?" And they can walk around and talk about that story. And so it's kind of a win-win based on like what's popular, what will speak to the students that you're asking your survey to.
Thank you so much.
All
Cool.
right.
Any last minute
Cool.
questions? I think we're good.
Yeah. I was gonna say we're just about at time. So if there's no other questions, thank you everyone. Thanks, Sim.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.